folks. Sorry we didn't have it out before. Agenda's here.
Waiting to sign up? Yeah.
Thank you.
Those are for the people who are going to. We should have gone the long one then? We should do the long one. You can. Let me see. You're pretty well.
Is this plugged in?
Right? Hello? It's just terrible. And I don't want any.
That was a close up.
Oh god.
Do you run it? Yeah, this is for the speakers, for like the moderator or the speakers.
So we're a little bit after 6:30. I think we'll probably go ahead and get started. I guess it comes as no surprise that a beautiful day in Burlington and our turnout's a little bit less so than it was last month. But perhaps we'll have a few other people coming in, and of course this is a good turnout in and of itself. And we have we're live streaming. This is a second meeting that we're live streaming on YouTube as well. So hello to our online viewers. And then the meeting will be recorded and posted later. My name is Ben Travers. I'm on the steering committee for the Ward 5 NPA. The other steering committee members here this evening are Nate Orshan, Alec Bauer, Joe Derry, Joanna Grossman, and Andy Simon was in here, and he'll be back in, I'm sure. Bill Keogh is also a member of the steering committee, not here at the moment, but we'll see if he arrives a little bit later on. I think we have a small enough crowd that perhaps it makes sense for us to just go around and have folks who are here in attendance introduce themselves and let us know where you live in the neighborhood. I'm on Home Avenue. Could we start over here?
Yeah, I'm Jim Dunn. I live over on Central Avenue, which is over at Lakeside, right on the street where the St. John's Club is. And I also wanted to come, I'm on the police commission, so I'm sort of a representative from this area. And, you know, as in terms of outreach, if you have issues with the police department or you need a way to kind of reach into the department and around and available, I try to put my stuff up on front porch, my connection. So anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Great.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Bailey, and I live in the Red Rocks condos.
Spencer Smith, I live across the street at the Flint Avenue Park.
Thanks, Spencer.
Martha Lang, I live in Ward 1, and I'm here to express my displeasure at the school department's plans for selling property next to my house.
Well, welcome to Ward 5. And and on the agenda this evening, you know, we had folks here from the school district at our last meeting, and we thought that this meeting would present a nice opportunity for us to, as a community, have a discussion with respect to follow-up thoughts or additional thoughts people may have had since that meeting, and hopefully that will sort of gauge us with respect to where we go from here. So I look forward to your input when we get to that point on the agenda. Right here?
I'm Marcia Gustafson. I live on Austin Drive, up in Red Rock.
Hi, Marcia. Andy?
I'm Andy Simon. I'm on the Ward 5 steering committee. I live on Locust Street.
I'm Joanna Grossman. I'm on the steering committee too, and I live right down the street on Flint. And thank you all so much for coming here.
In the back?
Good evening. My name is Henry Moniz, firefighter over here, Station 5. Recently assigned the senior position over here. Look forward to serving the community. Unfortunately, I don't live in the community. My name is Mike Harden. I'm the captain of Engine 5, and we wanted to come and be a part of the community, so that's what we're here.
Well, I'm glad you're here at this meeting as opposed to last month's meeting, because you may have had to flex some muscle. We may have been above code. I don't know. We had a pretty packed room at our last meeting, but thanks very much for coming. I live right down in this neighborhood as well. We love having your station down here. My soon-to-be 3-year-old daughter loves to come over and visit you guys, and you've always been awesome with respect to showing her around and letting her in the engine if it's there and available. So,
Anytime the truck's there, we're there.
yeah,
Everyone's welcome.
yeah, it's awesome.
Your house is as much as it is ours. So.
Yeah, thanks. Right here.
I'm Ann Zamrush. I live on Flint Avenue.
I am. Alec.
I'm Alec Bauer. I'm also on the steering committee. I live almost across the street from Andy, right on Locust Street, right by Calvin.
My name is Carly Henderson, and I live on Howard Street.
Hi, Carly. Joe.
My name is Joe Derry. I'm a Ward 5 steering committee member on Ferguson Avenue.
I think that just leaves you, Nate.
My name's Nate Orshan. I live on Linden Terrace here in South End, and I'm on the steering committee.
Great. We have an open forum period now. I know a couple people mentioned it when they were introducing themselves. Oh, hold on. The folks in the back from CEDO, would you mind introducing yourselves?
My name's Pitt. I staff at NPAs.
I'm Sydney, I serve with the mayor corps.
Great. these guys are obviously an essential part to all of our meetings, and so thanks very much again for being here. And you guys were essential in our being able to start live streaming at our last meeting, so thanks, and we're glad to be able to do this again this meeting and going forward. So in any event, what I was saying is that we have an open forum period, so to the extent folks have anything to say, we will get into our discussion on the schools momentarily, but if folks have other items they'd like to discuss, please feel free to introduce that now. Alec?
I have an item that's not so much for discussion, just maybe to let folks know. I got a call today, apparently at random, from, I'll probably screw up the actual agency they called from. I think it was the Vermont State Division of Parks, Forests, and something else, but they are doing
Forest Parks and Rec.
FPR, exactly, Forest Parks and Rec. They're doing studies around Burlington, elsewhere around the state. They're focusing on Burlington in the early to midsummer, sort of June-ish, July. Some folks around here may get a call. They're picking plots at random to do a tree study, and it's not of any particular. It's not related to emerald ash borer or any other invasive species. It's more just a inventory of trees, and given plots that they said that they're selecting somewhat at random. Though what I thought was interesting was that the plots they're selecting are not based on property guidelines, and so we were called because the plot that they're selecting for in our area, I don't think it's the only one, but the reason they were calling me was because it encompasses part of our property, part of the Jackson Terrace apartment complex property, as well as part of Callahan Park. And I had a really interesting conversation with them and asking them about emerald ash borer and other invasive species, Atlantis, and a few others. And I don't know if anybody else is going to get that, but I thought it was cool from like a geeky tree perspective.
Yeah. I know that our last meeting you were 30,000 some feet in the air, perhaps watching us on the live stream.
Yeah, I was.
We had the city arborist here. I don't know if you caught that part of the discussion, but
I missed that. That might have been during the technical difficulty.
yeah, perhaps. But for folks who weren't here, he gave a really interesting discussion on the threat that's being presented by the emerald ash borer, and so
Yeah.
I think we're going to want to have a follow-up from him at some point in time. Anyone else?
Speaking of trees, I was wondering if the new building on the corner of Flynn and Pine, if they're planning on planting any trees.
There are some in the back.
In the back.
They just dropped them off.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm relieved to hear that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we had those folks here in the very early development stages, but I was thinking that at some point in time we may want to invite them back, because I've had some questions about what's going in that first floor and things along those lines. I suspect Joanna does as well, living on Flynn Avenue. Yeah,
The parking
right.
situation would be for businesses.
Right, exactly. Andy?
Ruby Perry and I have been loosely so far organizing a group called Friends of Anglesby Brook. And we would like to get people engaged over the summer and in the fall in thinking about the Anglesby Brook watershed, and people tend to think about it as, it's in my backyard or it's over there or over here. We want to really kind of engage people in protecting and preserving this failed brook that is now, identified by the federal government as a failed waterway because of the amount of storm surge and phosphorus that comes into it from various neighboring businesses and lawns. Thinking about the whole watershed that goes from the golf course down to the lake, and what we can do together to both tell the story of the brook and all of its history and pieces and problems, and also to protect it. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, talk to me, and there will be more information. We'll do a presentation, I think, in the fall here at the NPA.
I just learned at the conservation board this last week that Inglesby Brook is an official wildlife corridor in the Burlington Open Space Plan.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Well, Andy's email's on the agenda if anyone wants to get in touch with him. I have no idea how you got the email, earthadventure@gmail.com, it seems like.
Long story.
Yeah, right. You must have had Gmail for a long time. Yeah.
Speaking of water quality, it looks like the legislature's not doing anything about the lake this time, no money or anything for that. And also, at Oak Ledge, I went through for the first time, 3 months because of long snows. And saw there's a series of posts, which I guess are anchoring trees and bushes. They're trying to, that swampy area, you know, as you go past the big shelter and you head towards, Austin Drive or whatever it is out at that point. It's very involved, and has anybody else been out there lately and looked at it?
What are they doing?
Oh, these posts.
Yeah, I don't
There are a
know.
lot of posts, and I asked somebody who was walking through that, I said, do you know what these are? And she said, well, there's something about the birds. And they had a sign that was hard to get to, but it looked like they're trying to make this a wildlife refuge, a swamp, whatever you wanna call it.
Well, I think they're trying to get it back to
They're trying to get it back, it's always been a wetlands, but they haven't treated it as such.
Right.
Well, it used to be a softball field, right?
Right,
They kept
so they-
running.
It's, yeah, the ball
Yeah.
field, yeah.
They've done
I know
away
what
with
you're
the ball
talking
field
about
and,
now.
yeah.
You know what, Jesse, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Jesse Burgess, the former Parks Commissioner, actually, talked about this a little bit at an NPA back when we were at DPW that, yeah, actually, it's funny, my husband used to play softball in that field and it was always so
Yes.
wet. And Jesse did some research and discovered that it's actually a class 2 wetland and they're letting it revert back to
Yeah,
a
which is great.
take it out.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think they're gonna damage our brook, if they really put in this Champlain Parkway, because they're green and, I don't know, they're just having to go around the brook or they're gonna put it through like a culvert, which is not natural. We have a lot of birds and wildlife over in this area, right across the street between the co-op and this building's right across the street.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with respect to your question on the legislature, we should have a good amount of time this evening with Senator Ash, and I'd encourage you to raise that question with him again. Anything further? Okay, we wanted to have a quick discussion because May generally marks our last substantive meeting of the year. In June, we're going to try to put together our NPA social, but there won't be much of a business agenda for that meeting. And then we generally take a break in July and August before beginning up again with our substantive meetings in September. And this is our third meeting, right, at City Market, or third or fourth? Third meeting at City Market, I think. And of course, leading up to this point, we had historically held our meetings at the Department of Public Works building. And so we thought we would just sort of open the forum to discussion on how people feel about this as a venue. Our meeting time has been switched. Typically it was from 7 to 9. Now we're doing it from 6:30 to 8:30. We've approached City Market about whether or not they would be open to moving it perhaps even earlier from 6 to 8. And so we thought we would see if folks had strong feelings one way or another as to whether or not when we kick things back up in September, should we stay here? Are folks yearning to go back to the Department of Public Works? Is there another venue in the neighborhood that people would be interested in? Thoughts, emotions?
Has everybody gone to a meeting at the DPW conference room?
Yeah.
So you can compare and contrast more easily.
You could pick up a few groceries here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think the room is of comparable size, I think. Yeah, I think a couple folks have had a hard time finding the room here, but we as a steering committee have been thinking of ways that we could station. I think Alec and Andy were downstairs to put people up here. I think we've also been thinking about spending some of our very limited budget, but a budget nonetheless, on some additional signs advertising the fact that the meetings are down here. City Market has been a good partner in opening this space up, and of course the technology in the room permits for us to now live stream these types of meetings. Personally, I'm open to continuing here. You know, the one thing that I will raise is that when we first moved down here, I personally received an email from some folks who live closer to DPW and don't have a car. And they were able to walk to the Department of Public Works because it was more centrally located to their house. Of course, the city market is more southern within our neighborhood, and they indicated to me that in moving down here, they were no longer able to personally attend the meetings. So I think that's, again, not to talk about the live streaming too much, but I think it's another good reason why we have that available, but I thought I would raise that nonetheless. Would folks generally be in favor of us continuing here in September?
You said you had a really big meeting last time. I was unable to come last time. Was that because, in April, was that because of a school discussion or something?
Yeah, I think that was because of the school discussion. It was really sort of the first opportunity that the community had with the school district to discuss the issue. I think, there are certain things that if we're having another big meeting like that, we might want to readdress. Maybe we would reconfigure the room facing lengthwise. We need to, I think, learn the climate control stuff in here a little bit more because it got a little bit stuffy. But those don't appear to me as issues that would be insurmountable going forward.
What if some people said they couldn't, needed to walk to the other place that was better for them? I don't know, maybe, that's why I was asking about numbers last time. I mean, I can go to either place, but I end up driving, so.
Yeah. Well, and maybe, why don't we, unless there's strong opposition, I think what I'm hearing is why don't we kick things back off here come September, and then we can revisit whether or not we host a meeting here and there back at the Department of Public Works, because perhaps that would permit an opportunity for folks who aren't able to attend here for one reason or another to still make a meeting or two.
I think that the last meeting, there were a bunch of people with young children. And it was a little bit, one of the disadvantages that I could see right away was that sort of for kids to have any kind of a play space outside of the meeting room, which was very crowded. There were kids playing out in the hall here, which wasn't so bad, but I think, was something that we should think about in the future as well. Because if we're gonna have an early meeting and we do want people with kids to be able to attend, at least for the first part of it, I think one of the things we should discuss with City Market is like, can we have a childcare space with anything at all? I don't know what the rest of the school is like, except for the teaching kitchen next door, which probably wouldn't be appropriate. Don't play with knives. But,
Well, the cafe is probably not active after 7 o'clock, I don't know.
yeah, it's just, it's always a problem for us in terms of sort of thinking about the meeting. Like,
Yeah.
how do we make it accessible to people with kids?
It's true that DPW had the couches and we did
Yeah, it
just
did have
hang
a
out.
little-
Yeah, that was really the only benefit in my mind.
Yeah.
But it was there, yeah.
I like that, I do like that as a part of the civic structure of the city, that our meetings were held in a public building. As far as DPW goes, I think it's kind of an intangible benefit. I like that the room there has, as Annie alluded to, a little bit better overflow space. But your point about reconfiguring this one, except on nights when we have somebody on the agenda who needs to use the screen or needs to plug in for any reason or another, there's no reason that it couldn't orient this way so that the door opening, closing, as some of our presenters don't come at the very beginning and leave at the end. People often come and go during the meeting, and watching the live stream, it's you can hear the door a lot when folks are coming and going from last month's meeting. But I would support staying here for some of the other benefits. Live streaming, it's a nice room, you can get groceries.
Yeah. All right. So perhaps a topic to revisit at another meeting here at City Market down the road. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. So the next item on our agenda is, as I mentioned earlier, we had a nice discussion, but not a long enough discussion at our last meeting with respect to the school district's capital plans. We had our two school board members, as well as Claire Wool, came down and met with us. And then, of course, we had the school district here, Nate Lavery, right? Who's the school district's director of finance, as well as the architect for the capital plan, the project manager from the architect's office, and they gave a presentation and took a few questions. But I think a lot of questions were left hanging out there, and of course there's been additional progress on that plan since then. The Conservation Board met on May 7th, and there have been various school board meetings with respect to it. And we don't have Chip or Joan yet here, but I suspect that they would be able to weigh in, because I know that they have been looking at this issue as well, including by talking to the city attorney's office with respect to some various questions that have been raised regarding the way the bond monies have been spent and the way the bond monies were presented to voters in March of 2017. So I'll be interested to hear from them as to whether or not there's any updates or progress on that question. But we thought, sort of here as a community, we don't necessarily need the school district here. To the extent folks had follow-up questions or thoughts, that they could raise them here, and we could sort of use this discussion to decide where we go from here as an NPA in future meetings. Yeah.
My name is Martha Lang, I live in Ward 1, and I live next to the Ira Allen School Building, which is the administrative office for the school district. They're planning on moving the administrative office down here and selling the land next to where I live, which is near UVM. What I want to say is that there are a lot of options that the school department isn't considering. For example, the administrative building on Colchester Avenue. Right to the side of it is what is the elementary school that I went to. It's a 9-classroom building, huge gym, kitchen. It belongs to UVM. So I went on a tour of the site, and the guy didn't even know that there was a school building behind the administrative building. What I'm saying is, let's consider buying that back from UVM. It's in good condition. UVM takes care of their properties. There are a lot of options that the school department isn't considering. And I also want to say, and I've followed this very carefully, one of the reasons the school department is in this situation without any administrative swing space is because they sold Taft School. Taft School used to be the go-to administrative area. They sold it. You know, I said to the guy, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Don't sell more property. Consider options. There's a huge building across from the school department on Colchester Avenue near the India House restaurant. It's used for office space for the construction of the hospital. The hospital is going to be done in 6 months. How about renting that? There are options out there, and I will tell you that to spend money that was bonded for capital improvements on construction, that just doesn't cut it. I call this whole deal with the school department, I followed them. I tried to stop the sale of Taft School. You can see how far I got. I call it Telecom 2. You've got the same lawyer for the school department who advised on telecom. You have a school across the street without any windows. The architect that designed that school is the one involved with this project. You have to do, if I had an interested party status in this neighborhood, believe me, I'd be, but I just wanted to tell you, and they haven't even come to Ward 1. They don't have to legally. You only have to go to your ward and the new North End because they're doing more than 10,000 square feet of development. I have been following this. Somebody's got this. I went to the DRB on Monday night, Tuesday night, about the Edmonds project. It's like Swiss cheese. It's full of holes. I'm telling you.
Edmonds interior, it's only the interior.
No, they're putting a cafeteria in a basement that has been used for storage for 20 years. The building has drainage issues. They are quote unquote making a green space next to the dumpsters, the condensers, and the loading dock. And it's right by the main road, a driveway. They didn't even talk about a fence. And worse than that, I'm the only one here. Worse than that, I spent Sunday morning going to the Edmonds site. I wanted to be informed. I really like my ducks lined up. You understand? Nobody on the DRB had even done a site visit. They're trying to steamroll us. I'm telling you, I've got a lawyer. If I had interested party status, believe me. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. Just out of curiosity, I know the school district invited people to tour their current administrative office space. Have they started those tours yet? Did you
I
go?
was the only one there on Monday.
Yeah.
That being said, I only happened to find out about it late Sunday night. I spent hours on this website fishing around. So I was the only one. I will tell you, this young man doesn't have a clue in the world what he's doing. And I told him that.
I'm sorry, which young man is that?
The man who gave the tour. He didn't know that there was another school building behind the administrative office.
Is that Russ?
I don't know what, the guy was a little,
Oh, I don't know. I think their PR person is doing the tours.
but what I'm trying to say is, if there's a room school building behind the administrative office, and the man giving the tour doesn't know, I know it's there because I went to school there. Now, you've got to consider other options. That would prevent them from building this building down here with administrative offices on the second floor.
So, just to rip off that a little bit. So, my name is Joanna Grossman, and it's not right, but anyway. So, in addition to being on the steering committee here, I am a parent, and I have a daughter at Champlain Elementary, and I've been working with a lot of parents who are very concerned about the capital plan. Actually, not just parents, but a lot of just community members in general.
Taxpayers.
Right, and so one of the tier 1 priorities that was initially outlined in the plan was to make an addition off Champlain Elementary. Right now, Champlain has a situation where the gym and the cafeteria are one room, so the kids basically have to eat really fast so that they can get all the kids in and out, and it's kind of a chaotic schedule, and it's really not great. And it's then when they put a curtain up so gym can be on the other side, but it's really loud. It's really not ideal. And so the district had outlined as part of the capital plan, part of the initial pitch for this bond that we all passed, was to make an addition on Champlain that would make it so there's a separate gym and cafeteria, and there would be a few new classrooms off the back of the school. And that plan has been scrapped in favor of building these new buildings. So my thought is that if we build that and use that as swing space, then the district can go ahead with their repairs, and that won't be a problem anymore, because the whole justification for the new buildings is that they want to use Ira Allen for swing space, so while the repairs are being done. So I say, let's build something that we already know that we need, because building new buildings for a temporary problem is a permanent solution, right? It's not what we want. So that's an idea that I've been floating with a lot of parents, and that I've raised with the school board and the council, and that's something that I'm just floating out to you all.
Andy? So, I know that there are people like Joanna who've been following this really closely, and Joe, and Ben. I guess I have questions about where we are in the process in terms of this plan that was presented last month, and so where the pinch points are in terms of that.
I know a little of that. So the school board.
Would you mind coming forward so we can see you?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm starting. Sure, just for a second though. All right, so let's see, how does this work? So, the school board has these plans, and they've been RFP'd. They've been designed by architects, they've been RFP'd already. The bids will come in July. The interior for Edmonds is different. That's gonna be voted on in June, I believe. The contracts for the rest of the project will be voted on by the school board in July. That was the initial plan. Now, I've heard, as of last night, that there's talk that they might split off the new construction into a separate up or down vote as early as the end of May. So if you're concerned about this and you haven't contacted your school board members, do it now. So I'm not sure about that. It's like a rumor that I'm just spreading now, because I probably shouldn't do that. But anyway, so that. Does that answer your question? With Champlain, they've been to that conservation board once. They have to go back again, and then they would go to the DRB. I think they might already have a scheduled date at the DRB for the CP Smith project, but I am not sure about that. So those are the decision points that I know of.
Can I ask a question? I'm very confused as to how this could be going out to bid, given the state of the drawings that we saw last month. If you look closely, the first floor plan and the second floor plan, the elevator was actually on different sides of the building. So unless this is a fancy German elevator that moves horizontally, something was not quite coordinated. So either they were sloppy with their feasibility, which they were, the floor plans didn't match, or they're just not that far along with the design. So if they're not that far along with the design, I don't see how they could have gone out to bid unless it was a construction management process and they were just getting bids to manage the project rather than actually bid out to subcontractors. So that's just what I've seen, and I'm curious if anybody has any further information, because what you're describing going out to bid doesn't jive with what I've seen them present.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I have other concerns about the plans. I mean, and I've actually, I mean, the architect that was chosen was not chosen through a competitive bidding process because the district is exempt from that requirement. So it's just someone who was picked and who always does these, and there's a lot of concerns. I've even heard from like inside, that the project lacks energy efficiency and creativity, and it's not great. And so one thing that they talked about a lot with the conservation board is that the parking lot kind of clear cuts forest just along Inglesby Brook, which also cuts into a class 2 wetland. And as we just talked about, Inglesby Brook is an impaired watershed and a protected wildlife corridor in the open space plan. So, yeah.
That's the piece of it that, really, there's many, many pieces that, bother me, but that seems just, really hard to comprehend. That they actually built a wetland, they spent a lot of money engineering that wetland to try to improve the water quality that was going into the lake, so they could open Blanchard Beach, and Blanchard Beach, I think, is somewhat better, but is sometimes closed. And, I just can't imagine, further impairing that wetland area.
From what I understood, the water and the way that the topography works, that water that will land on the new parking lot, which I don't like, but will go back to their drainage swale behind to the north. So it won't go unimpeded into Inglesby. So I'm sure they're following all the rules. They have a good civil engineer, and whether the plan is good is questionable, but I don't think they're gonna make the water quality worse with this plan.
I'm not just
From
talking
my professional
water
experience.
quality, I just mean like, you've got, a piece of, forest
Yeah.
with a wetland running through it.
I think
And
it should
to,
be.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of wildlife, it's,
Yeah.
it's something we have that we, will lose, and you can't replant forest once you take it over.
Alan?
Given the concerns on both the appropriation of the funds, given the language, which I'm not super well versed on from a legal perspective, but given the concern around that, whether it's just optics or not, given the concerns around the site plan,
outstanding questions with respect to this project. Before our last meeting, to the school district's credit, they reached out to us with respect to wanting to come to this NPA, and you mentioned that they were required to come here because of the size of the project, but actually, to the extent they're exempt from anything, schools in Burlington are exempt from having to go, what you're referring to is major impact review.
No.
So, no?
Vermont state statute for NPAs, any construction that involves more than 5 planned unit development or construction over 10,000 square feet. I understand, and I have the laws of what schools are exempt from. There's no exemption for schools for, and they clearly plotted out which ones, I have the copies, which ones they were gonna go to. They were coming here, and they were going to the new North End. They had no intentions of Ward 1, no intentions of the old North End or Karen Paul's district. I have all the documents.
Right.
By law, they had to come here, the new North End.
Well,
They did, yes, but it wasn't planned.
yeah, I don't know that I'm equipped to have a legal debate with respect to it. I know that the school district said that they were exempt from having to go through major impact review, and that they weren't here in the same capacity that, for example, City Market came before our NPA, and we had to sign off on a form indicating that they had come to a neighborhood meeting before they could go through the application process. The school district did not ask that of us, and I think it's because they're of the opinion, at least, that they're not required to go through that same process. But in any event, they were the ones who asked to come before this NPA. I think they underestimated the way this community would be engaging with the project, because they asked for only 20 minutes to meet with us the last go around. But clearly folks have more questions. So I suppose my question to this group here is, to the extent more generally, does the NPA still have a role in this process, right? I know that they've been before the Conservation Board, they're going to go, and they have gone before the DRB. There are various other entities that I'm sure they're going to go before as these projects move forward, and so.
I think they were at Champlain yesterday evening, Joanne, is that right?
Yeah.
They were, yeah, and I actually just wanna, I found out from Marty, actually, that they're not entirely exempt from major impact. I still don't, and I really need to backtrack and follow up on this, but part of the project is, but part of the project isn't, and I don't really understand that. But, they're not entirely exempt from major impact. Yes, they were at Champlain Elementary and did a presentation last night. I've actually been really ill, so I had to miss it, but I talked to a lot of people after, and I heard it was a productive conversation that didn't sway many people's opinions, but that there was a good dialogue.
All right. So, yeah.
I just wanna say, also for the staff at NPA, they did put a request, the school district through, for me to put up all NPAs to present.
Huh, well, that's good news.
Whether or not the other NPAs pick it up, it's up to them.
Was that part of the same request that came to us that brought them here last month?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so that did go all out.
So with these various other venues where they're going to be presenting, I suppose the question to the group is whether or not this NPA should be inviting anyone from the school district back. I think that certainly we should be and will be inviting our school board members to come back in and speak with us. But as I mentioned before, we weren't planning on holding a substantive meeting until September. So I think that that's another issue that's perhaps worth discussing here before we wrap up this portion is whether or not folks feel like we should be having a more substantive meeting before we break for the summer. We could have a business part to our agenda at the June social that we're trying to put together. So if folks are interested in doing that, I think now's the time to speak to it. We could invite our school board members back. If folks feel like we should be inviting any members from the district back, we could certainly extend that invitation to them as well. Nate?
Yeah, I would say because this seems to be a very time-sensitive issue, it behooves us and them to get together. So,
And when you say them,
the school board, and if we can get anyone from the school district, that'd be great, but at a minimum, Mike and Jeff, so.
Chip?
I would just say the one caveat is not entirely knowing what happens next. So it's a little bit difficult as a group to decide we do or do not, we don't want people back without knowing what the next step of the district or the school board is going to be.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think June, I don't think it would be unreasonable to ask the school board members to
this is solving in a material way. And I want to believe that it's there, because I want to believe that all the designers and the folks that have been brought into the mix are good, upstanding professionals, and that they know what they're doing, and they have directives, and they have a clear program guideline to design to, and they've got problem statements that they're solving for. And on this one, I haven't yet seen that. Chip, go ahead. You get.
So I did go to the PTO meeting last night, and there was a very good explanation of that, and I did bring sort of, at least my perspective, which is similar to yours, was that was the first time I actually heard a good articulable reason for why this
Doing
project was
all this,
being
right?
done. And I will also say, something that that I think the community has had concerns about is the Pine Street drop-off. That's been an issue for years, and whether you like the road or not, one objective was to try and
To solve for that.
problem.
Yeah, that was the one piece that I had heard was that.
But, I mean, we heard, now I'll forget her name, but the head of the preschool, district-wide did give a very effective why statement, that the district was moving in that direction. And it is powerful, but unfortunately, I asked the question, did I miss the community conversation about this? And she did say, there has been much discussion among providers and maybe at the board and district level, but not as a community. And I did bring that this might be cart before the horse here. I think those in attendance were very much like, oh, okay. As Joe is alluding to, there is an issue, with the preschool, a population that's not being served, but that conversation maybe should be had before we go forward with.
Yeah, and I guess my sort of code on that is that I would want both people who are against the plan and those who don't really yet even know the plan to maintain some degree of openness, that there are solutions, or that there are clear directives for which this may be a solution that haven't been well communicated. And that's where the sort of frustrating part for me is. I know there's been a lot of sort of direct and immediate reaction to it, and I think for good reason, but I don't want what might otherwise be a kernel of goodness in this plan to be completely overshadowed. So I'm glad to hear, at least, from both of you, that there was some productive conversation last night. Not that it's germane to moderator's question, but.
Well, and I think just to add on top of that, I think regardless of what happens with this project, I think folks have learned a lot through this process about sort of how things operate. Like, for example, before this process, I would have thought that if our school district was going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on architectural plans and bringing in various consultants and so on, that would be something that would go through some sort of RFP process. And it was news to me that they're not required to do that. So I think that these are some more general questions that, regardless of what happens with the plans, we should probably be following up on in some capacity as to whether or not some changes are owed there.
It doesn't make sense to me why the school would be exempt, but the state of Vermont or the city of Burlington have very clear procurement policies around when they do and all kinds of put things out to bid. So why the school would be different, that doesn't make sense to me.
It pertains to schools and religious organizations, churches. They don't want to prevent the building of a necessary structure or prevent the education of the students, but it only pertains to certain topics. You can comment on traffic, lighting, groundwork. It's all listed in the state statute. So but I want to say one thing, that if the school really needs something, ADA, American with Disability Act, they don't go through a standard permit. And I'm sure the fire department will tell you that life and safety issues don't get, bickered back and forth. You tend to and you tend. So what we're talking about are extras. This has nothing to do with ADA, nothing to do with life saving issues. It's all, and there are places you can stop them and discuss it. I've been following this very closely.
Yeah.
I'm your friend.
We started a bit late, but I want to make sure we stay on. Do you have another comment?
Yeah, I just had a feeling, I was here at the meeting last time, and that I wondered how these two guys, the architect and the civil engineer, got hired, because they seemed sort of out of tune with the community, and it wasn't put out to bid. Who made the decision to hire them, do you know?
Well, what the school district has said is that they've had a long-standing relationship with that architect. And their reasoning as to why they went with that architect as opposed to putting it out to bid is because they've had that relationship. They view it as a good relationship and they wanted to maintain it. Whether or not that's a good reason as to why they went with them or not, I think that's up for the community to decide.
And the thing that really put me over the edge was, they were talking about the road, and, could cars go through, and wouldn't it be dangerous if cars were driving through all the time, and the civil engineer said, well, we could put up a gate. What, yeah, who are you gonna hire? You know, hire somebody to open and shut the gate? Really?
Well, our steering committee will be meeting again sometime in the next week or two to plan for our June meeting, and my sense is that folks would be interested in hearing at least from our school board representatives, so we'll certainly take that greatly into consideration in deciding whether or not we add a business portion to our agenda for our June meeting.
Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks everyone for
Yeah.
staying engaged.
Yeah, thanks.
Before we leave this topic, and you may have covered this, there is an online, I don't know if you've piloted this, there's a comment tool available online, and certainly if anyone has a view, do reach out to Jeff and Mike and share. I mean, they are clearly putting out the message that we're listening, so, you know, I think it's helpful for anyone that has a view to share that, you know, both with your, you know, your board members as well as the online, you know, that, if you share it just with your board members, that doesn't necessarily get to the superintendent. So, I mean, they did mention last night that every comment that comes through gets, you know, fed to Marty or Stacy or whomever. So, and that's pretty prominent. I don't have the website, but it's pretty prominent if you go to the BSD website.
Yeah. That same page also has an FAQ document that they put together that I think they're updating on, or trying to update on a weekly basis, and it does answer a lot of questions. Again, whether or not you agree with the answers, that's up for us to decide, but it answered a lot of my questions that I had, at least with respect to what the school district's answer was to those.
And there was a lot, in addition to the FAQ, I mean, there's links to, you know, prior NPA meetings. I mean, it's, to their credit, they've done a lot
Yeah.
after the pushback.
Yeah, they've gotten the message
started.
that the community is interested and engaged. All right. So we have Sam Beal here with us. Sam, could you come up? So Sam is our Ward 5 representative to the Community Development Block Grant Program, and you just finished making your decisions for the coming years, that, or maybe not
It was
just, but
like months ago.
months ago.
Yes.
Wow, okay.
So, not recent, but yes.
Could you begin just by telling the group here a little bit about what the Community Development Block Program is, and then
Yes.
Going into the decisions you made for this year?
Sure.
Okay.
And do we have the ability to put up the spreadsheet on the screen? Not so much.
Technical difficulty.
Yeah. Technical difficulty. Okay, it's good. I got a really big screen here.
Should we all gather around?
Yes, gather around the iPhone. So the Community Development Block Grant Program is federally based. Most of the money that comes to Vermont goes to the Vermont Community Development Program and gets facilitated through that. But Burlington, because we are a metropolitan area, despite our small city status, we got our own pot of money. And so the total this year that we received was $416,000 for going to actual development, so that's buildings or other sort of things in the community, and then there's $124,000 that went more towards public service programs. And so myself, along with, I think we had 12 other people, 3 of whom nominated by the mayor, 1 each from each ward, and then a couple of other representatives from the state and other interested entities, met several times, 4 times in total, to review all the applications together, discuss their merits, and then ultimately make a decision about who and who would not get money. And so in terms of the development piece of it, which was the bulk of it, that $416,000 I told you about, there was basically an ask of about $420,000. So it was a pretty easy decision. We were going to fund all the projects. Unfortunately, one of the recipients, Youth Build, had a prior snafu with HUD, and it was determined after we actually voted to still give them the money that they cannot receive the money. So the good news is we're able to roll that money over to next year, and we'll be able to apply it to a project that can receive the money. I don't know any of the details about the Youth Build issue. It sounded like it was a paperwork thing, but unfortunately with HUD, the paperwork thing is a big deal. So despite some of the federal, allegations of federal abuse of money, CDBG money is very, very closely monitored, and we have a pretty good in-house staff in the city. they take 20% of the money that we get goes to CEDO essentially to manage the program. So that 20% is spent on oversight and making sure that the monies are spent correctly. So as an architect doing some nonprofit work, I'm familiar with the kind of reporting requirement that comes along with that. It's quite a lot. So so the development piece was good. I can tell you guys what projects received money if you're interested. So one of them was Laurentide Apartments, which is part of the Cambrian Rise project. Champlain Housing Trust is building 76 apartments there. I had to declare a conflict of interest because I work for the architect that is actually designing that. Youth Build was given money but cannot receive the money. St. Joseph's Community Center in the Old North End, another CHT project, also received $100,000. A Place to Call Home, which is something the Turning Point Center is putting together. It's on the first floor of what's called the McClure Building, I think. Anybody knows that? So they're yes. So they're redeveloping that. I think they are a substance abuse nonprofit. So that was a nice thing that we were able to give them some money. And then a couple of economic development programs also received money. The Women's Small Business Program that's put together by Mercy Connections, as well as the Financial Futures Micro Business Development Program by CVOEO, which sounds really boring, but it's actually, they're doing some pretty cool stuff with the makerspace and facilitating people who wouldn't otherwise be able to have access to that makerspace to potentially start new businesses. So I thought that was exciting that they're able to leverage this existing institution and try to improve that access. So where it got tricky was in the public service, where the ask was $273,000 and we had $124,000. So a lot of people weren't going to get the money. It was specifically asked that people ask for money to deal with opioid abuse as well as homelessness. Unfortunately, we didn't receive anything that really had anything to do with opioid abuse, so maybe next year we'll get somebody asking for money to help with that critical issue. In terms of who received the money, Home Share Vermont received $20,000. If you're not familiar with their programming, they facilitate people who may be elderly or may be disabled to stay in their home by facilitating a third party to come and live with them and pay us a nominal amount of rent, but maybe help out with meals or other sorts of things to help people stay in their home. So it's a pretty light touch that enables, two parties, one to have a less expensive place to live and another to stay in their home. Safe Tonight is a program by STEPS to end domestic violence. That's facilitating people who are basically in that shelter to find more permanent housing. Pathways also had another, asked for $97,000, we gave them $64,000 because, not because there wasn't enough money, but essentially they are facilitating people staying in their home once they find a new home. And apparently that's one of the major issues is we don't have quite enough apartments as it is, but the apartments we do have, we can't, for someone who's dealing with substance abuse or some other, maybe mental health could be another issue. If you just place them in the apartment and walk away and don't facilitate that sort of reintegration in the community, the chance of success is pretty low. And so a lot of these programs were meant to facilitate someone staying within that home once they were there, which we know will save money in the long run because hopefully that person won't be in an emergency room using expensive services there. We were not able to fund a program through the community health centers of Burlington. They were essentially trying to do a very similar thing, facilitating people who were chronically homeless, facilitating them staying within their home. We couldn't fund everybody, and so community health centers did not get funded. Burlington Bicycle Project, aka from the old Spoke home, they asked for a nominal amount of money we weren't able to fund to expand opportunities for young people within the summer to learn how to fix bikes. CVOEO asked for $10,000 we were able to give for the VITA program, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. It's a pretty cool program that helps people basically get a refund. And so there's a sort of multiplier effect by facilitating that program for people who can use that extra money. Burlington Children's Space asked for money to support a nutrition program that we weren't able to fund, in part because there wasn't enough money. So that's pretty much what we did. If you have questions about either the process or the results, I'm happy to answer what I can, but ultimately CEDO has most of the answers. So.
Is that where we would go if we want to look online to see
Yes,
those?
so CEDO would have both this spreadsheet and if Joe can get that to you, you can include this spreadsheet in the minutes if you want. Yes?
Sam, I missed the first part of that, I believe, but is the breakdown of the categories that you were talking about, is that federally mandated?
Yes, it's statutorily required. So we couldn't use any money slated for development for public services. Simply impossible.
And the proportions of
Is set by the original thing. It was in the 70s or whatever when they initially piloted the program. It's like part of the law that this percentage goes to projects and this percentage can go to public service. You can use public service money for development, but not the other way around. What I did learn through the process is each municipality and state does this differently, which is kind of the good and weird thing about America, that we use our federal money in such different ways depending on where you go in this country. And so some cities, the mayor will meet with 2 people, they'll decide who to give the money to, and that's it. There's no public process. It just gets done. The daily school, perhaps. But here we have a very public process. Everybody comes to the table. We, in that respect, it was really great. And even though it was a very difficult decision with public service money, in the end, everybody at the table pretty much agreed with how it went. So that consensus doesn't always happen, but it was it happened this time, and it was a good process. Okay, thanks guys.
All right, thanks, Sam.
Sam? Oh wait, I have one question. Sam, are you on for, is it a 2-year term? I remember
That was my understanding, was 2 years. So,
2-year term.
and it sort of flip flops. Half the committee basically turns over each year. So that way, I was the newbie, and now I'll be the veteran. And so it's a good, in that respect, I think it helps facilitate the community. So you don't have 12 new people trying to figure it out every time.
We can recall Sam though. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So before turning to Senator Ash, which we're really thrilled that you're here with us this evening, we'd like to hear from both Chip and Joan. You got off free from our April meeting, but we'd like to get your update as to the City Council's ongoings.
I don't think there's a seat for me.
It's right here.
Thank you. Want me to start?
At our last meeting, we had to make a decision about the superintendent of schools residency, whether or not they applied for a waiver of the residency requirement. I was in the minority on that vote. I did not vote to waive the residency requirement. And the reason I didn't vote to waive the residency requirement is because I think that sets a new precedent for a waiver. We have never actually waived a residency requirement for somebody who's moving here from outside the area. We've waived it, and we have rules that we follow about why we would waive it. We can't think of everything, and it did require a waiver because Yao cannot be a voter of the city. That's actually what our charter requires, is that you be a voter of the city, but because he's not a citizen, he can't be a voter of the city. So he definitely needed that piece of the waiver, but when we originally gave him the waiver, we still required him to move to Burlington, and then he didn't. So he was given a waiver and now has a waiver for as long as he lives in his house. That was the way that vote prevailed. Another thing that we did was we now have a mural task force, so we're going to be talking about how to address the situation with the mural downtown.
Can I just back up to sort of
Yep.
talk about on the residency, just so for everyone's benefit, we have a charter provision that basically says if your identified department heads have to be a resident of Burlington. That was put before the voters for repeal, I don't know, 10 years ago, and the voters said no. But there is, within the charter, there is an ability of the council to make an exemption for personal hardship. That's that's in the charter. And then we have rules, 2 exemptions in our rules. One says if your children are of school age, and you live in another town, that's, that fits within the hardship exemption. Another was if you move up through a department, so we have some department heads that didn't start as the department heads, and live in other jurisdictions, and that one's on. And then we adopted one more recently that basically says if you live in Chittenden County, and it would cause I forget the exact terminology, but significant hardship on your family, then that was added when Noelle McKay, the now departing head of CEDO, who was saying, I live in Shelburne, I've made significant improvements to my house, and it would be a financial detriment to me to have to sell my house for this position. So Yao was coming, asking for an exemption under that third criteria. I missed the council meeting, so I did not vote, but I would have also been in the minority. I've sort of taken the position, although we can debate whether it's a good charter provision or not. I've consistently sort of said it's there. I don't like sort of voting based on whether you like someone or not, or that story is a little more sympathetic than the other. So I'm sorry I missed the vote, but it turns out my vote wouldn't have mattered. I'm not sure my argument would have mattered either, but the vote was such that, and I respect that. I mean, I've listened to the debate. I think there was significant, the superintendent and the school board is in somewhat of a precarious position right now, and I do think there was concern at the council that were we to do that, that would not be beneficial for the school. But again, it gets back to that sole sort of point of weighing the merits of which seems a bit problematic.
Yeah, there wasn't a good answer, and
No.
personally, I'm not happy that we were put in the position to
Yes.
have to make that decision, but we'll move on.
Yep.
Because the school board really does have bigger things to worry about than that. We're moving forward with a redesign of Cherry and Bank Street. There have been a lot of public meetings about that, and I think there have been a lot of posts on Front Porch Forum. I went to a meeting last night. They redesigned Bank Street in response to what they were hearing at the community meetings. There was concern about not having bike lanes on Bank and Cherry. The walk-bike plan that has been adopted does not have bike lanes on Church and Cherry Street, but what they've done is they've designed...
Bank.
Yes, Bank and Cherry, sorry, yes. They have designed Bank Street to be a curbless street. So there, have you seen this?
No.
I think it was new at that meeting last night, but
I've heard of it. I can't conceptually. Yes, it's hard.
there are designated areas so that the cars will not be traveling on the sidewalk, but there's color delineations.
It is supposedly more pedestrian friendly. Is the articulated basis.
Right, and it does. I think it'll work well on Bank Street, which is a very short street. You're not going to be picking up a whole lot of speed from the time you stop at Church Street. The length of the street is pretty short, and it will be a very versatile design where you can close it for a block party or an event or the farmer's market or whatever, whatever we dream up in the future. And I think it's pretty exciting. Cherry Street will still be a traditional street, but we'll have a lot more amenities, and
There will be bike lanes, but not protected bike lanes. And sort of the way this has been.
No,
queued-
there are no. I don't believe there are bike lanes on
there
Cherry
were.
Street. There's bike sharrows, so it's a
Okay.
shared road
So
on
the,
Cherry.
you want to get into sort of the next debate will be Main Street, which is sort of, I don't know if you wanted to touch on that or not. We may agree, Joan and I may agree or disagree, but part of the tension always is, bike lanes versus parking. And you know, the walk bike master plan sort of errs on the side, although it's not binding, on the side of making things more bike friendly, potentially at the expense, but certainly I won't speak for the council. There is a concern among a segment of the council that, you know, as we continue to remove parking from the downtown to accommodate bike lanes, it's going to have a negative effect. So sort of the reason that, you know, Cherry and Bank have been designed in the way that they are, although we're not going to be voting on Main Street, but is the expectation that there will be, you know, dedicated bike lanes on Main Street, potentially at the expense of the diagonal parking that we currently enjoy. So just as a headline, that may be a debate that the council will be having, not next meeting, but a month or so down the road.
Yeah, and I'm open to your input. I am leaning towards not supporting bike lanes on that block of Main Street from Church Street to South Winooski, because I think that the businesses in that area really depend on that parking. Lower down, I think that that's not as needed. You're kind of far away from the parking garages in that area, and it seems to be well utilized. So, but that's something that will come down the pike in the future. Yeah, Sam?
Is it eliminating all of the parking along there, or is it just transitioning from diagonal to parallel?
Transitioning from diagonal to parallel.
So you lose
parking, but you don't lose all.
Correct.
Right, yeah, and they have the numbers. It was a substantial number of parking spaces being lost on, yeah. The other,
Sure.
yeah.
Is it lower Main Street that you're talking about?
It's the whole
All the way
length
up.
of Main Street. So there's diagonal parking, but there's not diagonal parking everywhere on Main Street. There's diagonal parking on the block from Church to South Winooski, and there's diagonal parking on the block from St. Paul down
Right.
to
Pine.
Pine.
Some areas are diagonal.
Sort of goes
parking on both
diagonal,
sides.
parallel, diagonal, parallel.
Right.
I mean, the theory is the bike lane for connectivity purposes, to add a, you know, east-west route straight up. Yes.
Yeah.
So, I think, I have a feeling that there's no long-range plan for the parking problem downtown. In other words, we're gonna have more and more cars with all this housing construction that's going on. And we're having tourists come in, and it seems like, have we thought about elevated parking lots? In other words,
So-
maybe story parking lots.
Sure.
And I propose that they should have them where people get into the city and then have shuttle buses to bring people downtown. But, I haven't heard anything about that. So I just wondered, what's the thinking about long range?
There has been much time spent actually on a downtown district. It's been headed by VBA. There have been multiple meetings. The report is, you know, not ready for prime time yet, but I envision there will be much discussion about potentially creating a nonprofit to sort of take over parking in the downtown. You may have seen recently on the UVM did a parking count study, and although there's the perception that parking is an issue in downtown Burlington, you know, the studies, the people that actually go out and count, have shown time and time again that's simply not true. You know, looking at the private parking garages, we all do the same thing. I mean, as do I. You drive, you know, around City Hall Park and there's no parking, and you think, oh my God, there's no parking in downtown. You know, if you go, you know, I work at a building that's a parking garage a half a block away, and it's half to 3/4 empty, you know, all the time. So, I mean, I do think there will continue to be a discussion and a debate about parking in downtown, but I can say we are focused on that, and I expect that conversation will continue. And you are correct, as you know, the city place goes up and other commercial development, which we're trying to incentivize, it is something we need to be mindful of.
But that project, we do think about it with every development project. We look at what the parking requirements are, and we require the developers to build parking that will meet their needs, their parking needs. We don't want developers building projects and then what their needs are, we might disagree on what the needs are, but we do not want their parking needs for their building becoming a burden on anybody else. So it is considered, it's also studied. Yeah, that's part of, you know, part of Act 250 permitting. That is all part of the consideration in the permitting processes.
Traffic is definitely an issue right now. If For anyone that tries to get in or around downtown, it's a bit of a disaster, which is,
Though the
Yes.
traffic calming project on Pine Street has been a huge success.
yes. I like it. I like it. I like it.
I will say we've had, and forgive me, I'll misaccurately remember who was here, but we've had a number of folks who were doing both. I think it was DPW and some other agencies within the city that were doing both downtown parking surveys extended, and also certain areas around town were getting residential parking assessments done. I will say that in light of that happening, and that goes back a couple of years, that the last time we had a real discussion at the NPA on one of those topics. Since then, they have really opened up a lot of downtown parking. And while I think it's way too expensive, and they're really, they're real quick with the tickets if you're not there, right on time. So that's a little bit of a bummer on that side.
The
But there
private
is
lots you're talking
private
about.
lots, the
Yeah.
one next to Daily Planet, the one behind the federal building across from
Yeah.
whatever, lower
There's
Church
a
Street,
lot of 'em.
just south of Main. There's a lot of those kinds of lots that historically were not open at all, and in the last, 18 months or so, it seems like a lot of those have opened up. And again, they're expensive. It's like $6 an hour.
Yep.
In the meter, or with you pay with the card and whatnot. I also think it's great that most all of the downtown core is now mobile pay friendly on all the parking meters.
Yep.
So I think there's been a lot of improvement on that, which I think, kudos to the city on that. It's obviously still Main Street, and any loss of parking raises some concerns, but I
Sure.
think there's been some improvements as well.
And we're actually on the residential, we have a resolution on Monday night that deals with the long dormant residential parking that sort of encourages or asks DPW to look at the recommendations that were in the report from 2015 and report back by, I think, August. So parking's not going away. It's a continued discussion.
Often a very painful discussion.
Yes.
Andy?
Just in terms of bike lanes, I feel like I've experienced in Burlington this sort of tendency to create a bike lane, say on South Winooski Avenue, which is great, when you're heading south on South Winooski Avenue, but to get there, you risk your life. Biking down South Winooski Avenue through downtown is a harrowing experience as a biker until you get to Maple Street when there's a bike lane, you go, I made it in. The idea of creating a bike lane on Main Street that all of a sudden disappears horrifies me, to preserve some parking, because we do have a lot of parking downtown. And I really encourage you as council members to sort of think about the whole stretch of a particular street. And I know you do, but to think about, what the experience is, and I know you're a biker, so, when you get to those places where all of a sudden, it's car land, and you have to sort of traverse that to get to the next stretch of bike lane, it drives me crazy.
Well, I think you're right. South Winooski Avenue has to be the scariest place to bike, and we have to figure out what we're going to do on Main Street. But it's not on the table right now, but I certainly will, as you know, I'm biking Main Street, so I will be aware of it.
We have a couple more minutes before I'd like to turn it over to Tim. Is there
I
anything
wanna
else
just,
that you want an update
yeah, I
on?
wanted to talk about City Hall Park.
Right.
So we agreed to a process on City Hall Park. There was a movement by a group of people to save some trees in City Hall Park. Yesterday was the first meeting we agreed to sit down with a couple people from that group trying to save the trees. And so there are 3 city councilors on the committee, the mayor and the city arborist, and 2 community members. We took a tour of City Hall Park, and I thought it was interesting when you kind of take a closer look at these trees. It is amazing to me what poor health they are in. The trees, a lot of trees in City Hall Park have serious problems. And the other thing is, when you look at the plan for renovating the park, and you look at the tree canopy, and particularly if you look at you look at they're not planting small trees, they're planting the largest trees that are expected to do well. You know, you plant a tree that's too large, their growth is stunted for a long time, but they're trying to maximize tree growth in the size of the trees that they're selecting. And when those tree canopies mature, the City Hall Park, I mean, it looks from the plans we're looking at that City Hall Park will be like 80% shaded with the existing plan, but some people want to maintain more trees. When you look at kind of the options for maintaining trees, those tree canopies are woven almost into each other because there was never a plan. The City Hall Park we see together today was never planned, and so things are planted too closely. I think that you know, the discussion is focusing on saving some crabapple trees and possibly planting a couple new trees, and there are a few choices. There are 3 options, but one of the options would actually interfere with building an ADA path, which I hope that they don't select that option. I think the ADA path is important, but there are trade-offs with anything that you do. So
there's an aggressive time scheduled for this group to report back to the full council in order to meet the construction budget
and I think they're planning on having one more meeting. I'm not sure.
I mean, there was a consensus. Let's do what we can to see if we can save trees without actually committing to do it, pending the outcome of this group.
Right. That's all I had. Do you have anything else? Or were there questions?
I think you had started saying something about
Mural task force.
The Mural Task Force, we just appointed the committee to the Mural Task Force, so.
They've not yet had their first meeting, you know, that remains to be.
Right. So there's 7 community members that have been appointed to the Mural Task Force.
Well, I suppose I'll just ask one question, which is, you know, we're here for our April meeting, as well as you've heard sort of the tail end of our discussion here with respect to the school district's capital plan, and I suspect you both have received quite a bit of feedback yourselves regarding the issue, and I suppose my question is simply, do you see any role for the council in this process, including perhaps particularly with respect to the bond issue? I know that there's been some questions posed to the city attorney's office regarding that question, and of course reimbursement on that bond has to come through the city council, and so or issuing funds under that bond comes through the city council, I believe. So any thoughts with respect to that?
I think we've already voted that through, but Chip and I have been asking the city attorney, you know, what is our role potentially at this point? You know, do we have ways that we could influence that bond? And we have been, I think, politely persistent. The city attorney's office is, I know they work incredibly hard, incredibly long hours, and I know they're trying to get to this, but they haven't gotten to it yet. And the last thing I was told was that Eileen was hoping to get back to us on Monday.
I mean, so the
But
answer
it's of concern to me. I mean, I do agree with the point that this is a different project than what the expectation of the planned project really may have merits, but it's not meeting the expectation of the voters, I don't think, who voted on the bond.
I have been certainly passing along communications we've been getting from constituents to both of our elected reps as well as the school board, and sharing my own personal thoughts on this as well.
To be continued.
To be continued.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're lucky to have Senator Ash with us here this evening. Thank you for your patience, Tim. I know the legislative session. I know the legislative session sort of wrapped up, but you have plans to be back next week, and so we're excited to hear about the progress you made, and as well as the progress you perhaps intend on making in the coming days.
Well, so I could do one of 2 things. I could tell you a lot of things, or I could answer questions about things that you're interested in. I prefer, I think, the latter. I will just start with 2 big overarching themes. The legislature spends 95% of its time working in a bipartisan way in really coming up with solutions that we think are the right ways to tackle big problems. And you don't really hear a lot about that. What you hear about is the major points of conflict. Several months ago, we passed the most significant gun safety legislation probably in 60 years in Vermont. And I don't want it to be lost that Burlington's own actions in resolutions and encouragements of the legislature to enact gun safety legislation definitely was part of the foundation that allowed us to move forward. It was a very unusual experience for me. I've had hostile crowds that I've had to speak in front of. I've never been at a press conference to sign a bill where there were about 100 people, 50 of whom were very happy about the legislation passing, and then the other 50, to say they were unhappy would be a gross understatement, but the heckling was something I'd never seen, and it was with the State House behind us, so you got these big stone columns and the stone building, and so it was so intimate that each heckler, you could see their face. It wasn't a sea of faces. It was each person. You could actually, I think the governor, when he was speaking, knew which person was yelling at him, and it was quite brutal. But we've, I think, gotten past most of those initial raw emotions, and I think it's actually a very good thing for the state. The second thing is, we are, on Saturday night at 11:15, we adjourn for the year, knowing that our governor is going to veto any number of bills. It is a very unusual situation to have everyone celebrating mostly consensus work. Our budget passed 29-0, so our most conservative Republican and our most liberal progressives all voted for this budget. Our tax bill was co-written by Randy Brock. Those of you who know him know that he was a candidate as a Republican for governor, relatively conservative, but a wonderful guy to work with. He co-wrote it with Mark McDonald, who's viewed as one of the most liberal Democrats in the Senate, and the House counterparts were similar. And so it's a very unusual experience to have legislation that was virtually unanimous in every instance be on the veto block. And so the governor has called us back for a special session, which is relatively rare. I think there was one 10 years ago, and that was very brief, and before that it had been many, many years. So we're not quite sure what happens next, but next Wednesday we'll show up and take it from there. But I'd rather hear your questions, because then I can provide you the type of information that might be more helpful. So are there specific issues people would like me to tell you what's going on in Montpelier?
I was wondering, I got the impression from what I've read that there was no money passed for cleanup of the lake, that there was no effort on that.
Yeah, the governor said he would veto any money for the lake. So the legislature had a difficult choice. Does it spend a lot of time coming up with an intricate proposal, knowing that we actually have money for the next 2 years? So it's not like we have no money that's going to be going towards very helpful projects for the next 2 years. The problem is this is a 20-year or more thing that needs a solution. And so the current governor went into last year, his first year as governor, and said, I will veto any taxes or fees. That is my first year pledge. After the first year, he said, actually it's a first term pledge. So the problem is these problems don't fix themselves, and some things do take money. And agriculture being 50% of our water quality problem historically and today, farmers aren't rolling cash right now, the dairy farmers in particular. So the governor, basically the legislature decided it wasn't worth spinning wheels only for a veto. He even said he'd veto a study to determine what we should do to fund it. So that's kind of what we're working with. But it doesn't mean that we haven't both deployed about $25 million a year for each of the next 2 years for water quality projects, but also have set up a whole bunch of growing requirements for landowners and farmers and property owners to be making improvements on their properties. Dairy farmers, I'll just give as an example. Large farms, and there's 34 farms that are called large dairy farms. I think the number is like 600 cows or 800, I don't know what the number is. They have increasingly stringent requirements they have to meet. Medium-sized farms, which is probably 200 to whatever, 600 or 800, they have increasingly ratcheting up requirements, and then small farms will slowly have increasing requirements. These are all things that are going to mark a very important change. I will give you my personal observation. So dairy farms are all over the place. We don't always see them. One of my runs in the summer, I go through the bike path that runs towards Ethan Allen Park, and then I run through the Intervale, and then I come back up on Riverside Ave. The stretch between Ethan Allen Homestead and Intervale, there's a little stretch where you run along the river. And every year on a very hot day, I called it Cow Bend, because I would run, and on a very hot day, all the cows would be standing there, and it was beautiful, and they'd be going to the bathroom in the water. Well, as of a year ago, there is a fence which keeps the cows about 50 or 100 yards away from the water. That didn't happen by accident. So there are a lot of good regulatory things going into place as well. We have a lot of work to do.
In terms of that same subject, what is the legislature's role in terms of oversight of A&R, and particularly how they are implementing rules that we not pass? Because I've read multiple articles about, I believe the name is Moore, that she's sort of been slow walking certain reforms, and just wondering what your perspective is on that.
So some of you, if any of you have extraordinary interest in water quality and the quality of Lake Champlain, Julie Moore worked in the Douglas administration as the water quality czar, and then she worked for Stone Environmental, and she's a very high quality, competent person. The governor's office doesn't want what they view as burdensome regulations on developers and property owners and builders. That's just a truth. So her role in that, I don't want to, there to be conjecture. But what I do know is there was a requirement in our so-called water quality law from several years ago, Act 64, I believe it was called, that all properties with 3 acres or more of impervious surface, paved area, roofs, and so on, would have to meet a certain performance requirement. The rule was due on January 1st. No rules written. And it's become a pattern with our Agency of Natural Resources to miss these types of rules. The problem is the legislature has few tools when they miss it, other than to say, that was bad of you. Now we're going to set a new date. We hope you meet this one. So the legislature's opportunity is to use the appropriations of the state to influence the activities of an agency, but the problem is you don't want to withhold funds from them, because the whole point is you need them to do the work. So we've cajoled, we've tried to push, we've tried to nudge, but this is the consequence of an administration that doesn't believe in aggressively fighting environmental degradation. I mean, I don't mean it to be unkind, but I get, without going back to the election, if Sue Minter was the governor, I think we'd have an aggressive water quality strategy. Instead, we have a different governor with different priorities.
Do you get us up to speed on what's going on with the governor's education funding concept?
So the governor, over the last 2 years, the legislature starts in January, it runs till the first week of May or so. And typically, and I've served now with Governor Douglas for 1 term, Shumlin for 3 terms, and now Phil Scott for his 1st term. Typically, the agency officials and the governor's team are in committee rooms all year with the legislature. They're hammering out issues, they're fighting over details, but the goal was to get to a common objective, right? I don't think we have different common objectives, it's just different strategies to get there. The Scott administration is very different. They're nowhere to be found on most key issues. So what has happened each of the last 2 years is literally once all of the committees shut down and we're in wrap-up mode, where people are starting to just finalize bills and clean up the last details, the administration will come in with this sort of little education grenade. This year, the administration at the last second said, we have a 5-year plan. It requires mandatory cuts at schools all over the state. It could include penalties for districts that spend X number of dollars under different scenarios, and it's going to save $400 million. The numbers were all total speculation. They double counted major numbers. Their growth assumptions were all debunked. And the problem is it was a political move more than anything, I believe. One of the most worrisome things about this particular administration's approach to education, and I don't mean people like Rebecca Holcomb, who was till recently the secretary. The actual staff at the Agency of Education were very professional, working with districts, and had a lot of positive interaction. The fifth floor, which is the political office of the governor, almost every single proposal they've done would place all of the burden on public schools and not independent and private schools. So in large swaths of the state, dollars that are public tax dollars are tuitioned out to independent or private high schools usually. If under Governor Scott's proposals, for instance, his staff ratios, to cut number of students or cut number of teachers to get to these ratios, they wouldn't affect those other schools. So they could continue to have very, very low staff or teacher to student ratios. They can continue to be $20,000 per student. But because we don't directly manage their budgets, they would be off the hook. So anytime you try and put the squeeze on local taxpayers in a community, they turn to the people that they can flog. The people they can flog are their public schools. But if you're tuitioning out, that's just, you just keep paying the bill. They pay what we call the retail price. So the governor's proposal was not a very serious one. It has found no enthusiasts. The one thing he has found enthusiasm for, which is not unusual, is saying he will object to any tax rate increase. But I don't know that the governor understands that the tax rate that the legislature sets each year, which historically was not controversial, school voters voted to spend more, you float the tax rate up or down depending on how much you needed to raise. But there is no one tax rate for schools. There is a base tax rate. And then local spending is a variable that kind of multiplies against that base rate. So basically all over the state, people are paying a different tax rate depending on how much they choose to spend. So even under the governor's own proposal, more than 100 school districts, their taxes are going to go up. But he's oversimplified it in a way that's actually very digestible. Those of us who support public schools are often at a disadvantage. I will tell you, in the last week, 3 different reporters have asked me, but what's your bumper sticker slogan? And I thought, a $1.6 billion public education system that serves 86,000 students, and you want me to fit it into a bumper sticker? It's kind of sad. But anyways, that's the short story. It is the basis for the governor's vetoes. He is just insistent on whacking at the schools. And I don't know that you'll find people in Burlington who think our problem is that we spend too little. There are parts of the state where there's some probably ability to rein in spending. Don't get me wrong, but it's a very uncurious way of managing our schools to just say, here's a mandatory number. If you don't meet it, we're going to whack you. That's what the governor's proposed. Other thoughts or questions? I'm trying to speak directly. You can imagine it's been a little bit stressful.
Minimum wage, where's the minimum wage thing?
The minimum wage is at the governor's desk as of yesterday. It will probably be vetoed. It would raise the, it's always a little tricky. Our minimum wage law today increases each year based on an inflationary adjuster. So the bill would go to $15 by 2024, so 6 years from now. That's a $4.50 nominal dollar, meaning that it's $10.50 today, it would be $15 then, $4.50 is the difference. That's only about a $2.50 or so increase over what it would go up anyways with inflation. So sometimes people say, oh my God, it's a $450 increase. Current law would already gradually increase it some part of the way there. But that is likely to be vetoed, which is very disappointing. It would increase the wages of tens of thousands of people overnight. And there's also a paid family leave bill which passed both chambers. That would be almost like a micro charge on payroll. So every worker's paycheck, it would be, depending on how much you make, it would be, yeah, don't hold me to these exact numbers, but we're talking like a penny an hour or something that people would pay. And collectively, all the payments in would be in a fund, and then if you had an eligible need to stay out of work, maternity leave, caring for a sick parent, caring for a sick child where you have to be out for some extended period, you would be able to draw from this fund, and then you would have the ability to, anyways, you'd be able to draw from this fund. That is also likely to be vetoed. The governor believes that's a tax. It is, technically. The question is whether a hard and fast pledge to veto any tax should include something that's really a social benefit program. He has said he'd be open to a voluntary program, but if you had a voluntary program, it's hard to see how it would be like having a voluntary social security program, where it's just hard to see how you could enjoy broad benefits if very few people decided to pay in. So that's sad that he will probably veto a whole bunch of those kinds of economic.
And so what's his rationale for vetoing the budget that, so the whole legislature thinks?
We don't know. Basically, the budget has a tangential relationship to school spending because each year the budget transfers money to help pay for schools. So what he's saying is, if we, in the legislature, had taken an axe to the school districts, we could have sent less money from the budget to help pay for schools. And so he's vetoing it on that basis. And you have to understand how discouraged people feel when it was 29-0. Richie Westman, who's a Republican from Lamoille County, was sick. He would have voted. He helped write it. It would have been 30-0. And so you scratch your head and you say, if this was Washington, D.C. and the votes were strict party lines, you could see the governor sticking up. But it's laughable. I mean, these are runaway votes where people feel really good about what's in the budget. The tax bill, no one loves voting for tax bills, and yet almost every Republican in the Senate did, and a whole bunch of Republicans in the House, because it increases the residential base tax rate as much as local voters decided they wanted to increase spending on schools. It makes a lot of sense. We didn't overly tax people. We taxed them what they said they wanted to pay extra to schools. So people were scratching our heads. It's a very unusual.
So a bunch of us write and say, don't veto the budget.
I certainly encourage you to. You'll probably get an unsatisfactory response.
Right.
We've been at, even Republicans in the legislature are walking around with this shoulder shrug. It's like a constant shoulder shrug, and I haven't seen anything like it. It just doesn't feel serious. It's disengaged, and it's just too bad. I see two, but start there.
So, like, following on from that,
Yep.
what's the review for us, the procedure for overriding the veto?
Well, under normal years, the legislature, well, let me put it differently. Historically, there was no thing called a veto session. The legislature finished its work, it went home, and then the governor either signed bills, let them become law without signing, or vetoed, and that was it. Then, I don't know how long ago, there became the habit of when the legislature adjourned for the year, saying, we're adjourning, but we're setting this veto date out in May or June, just in case the governor vetoes a bill or bills, so that we can decide whether we want to try and override it. Well, the House Republicans have enough votes that no veto can be overridden right now in the House. So our feeling was, let's do the best job we can, get broad bipartisan consensus on the most important bills, which we did, and then go home. And if the governor wants to call a special session, he's free to do that. But then it's his choice. He's telling us that he's unsatisfied with these broadly supported bills. So when we return next week, he can call us into a special session, and that's what we will do Wednesday. But the moment we gavel in, meaning the moment that we start the session, the legislature runs it, not the governor, which means we start from scratch. So we're not using this as an opportunity to go wild with a bonanza of new legislation, but we do whatever we want on the budget. We do whatever we want on the tax bill. We do whatever we want on any other bills. And the governor then, and we just have to pass it with a majority. And then the governor will once again have to decide whether he wants to veto it. Now, we recognize that it's not good for anyone to have this uncertainty linger, on and on. But the governor's team tells us they have a non-negotiable position, no taxes or fees. And we said, we have a non-negotiable position too. We're not gonna trash our public schools. And we have a right to a non-negotiable position, just like you have a right to a non-negotiable position. And now what grown-ups do, when they hold what they say are non-negotiable positions, they try and find common ground and a compromise so we can move on and fight the next battle next year. So we have made some strides in the governor's direction. The governor has not moved at all. And so it's not clear quite what's gonna happen. It's most people in the long-time members of the legislature have never seen a governor act like this. It's just very strange.
That was a good answer, but very confusing. Not because of your answer, but you're saying, so the special session will not be to override the veto on the budget. You're saying you'll be starting anew on a budget, however, the governor's
Influenced by the governor's likely
coming in
veto.
saying you must pass my education, it must include my education reform proposal, or I'm gonna veto it, and you're coming, the legislature collectively is coming and saying, that's a non-starter, so good luck. You know, how long is the special session scheduled? Well, plus the other piece, which I appreciate, is with prior governors, there have been adults, including yourself, who have met behind closed doors to try and reach, or even in the public, to try and reach some accommodation. I've seen your response, I've seen the governor's, that seems relatively unlikely, at least today.
Last year, we had this same thing play out,
Yeah.
and most of us had a different expectation. Most of us had served with Phil Scott as a senator and as a lieutenant governor, so the relationship on a personal level was very strong. I mean, he and I are friendly, and we would go in and try and hash out these last differences, and you know, this was their negotiating position, and we were here and would say, okay, in good faith, we're ready to come here, and then they would take everything we put there, and then they would move their piece that way. And that didn't feel so good. So this behind the scenes thing, I think we learned our lesson that they're not really interested in a process where we each give a little bit, shake hands, and just move on. And so for my attitude, I want the public to watch his administration come in and explain why we should cut teachers at every school in the state. I don't want it to be said privately to me. I want everybody to see that. I want everyone to hear the positions they are staking out privately, which are very unpopular, but it's hard. I mean, I don't like this situation. We've got members of the Senate who, you know, really care, I mean, it seems almost old-fashioned, really care about the institutions and really want things to function the proper way, and they really feel like a sadness. The governor came in on the last night. Usually it's a ceremonial speech the last night of the session, and it's kind of a bridge building, whatever fights, you kind of put that behind. He came in with this dark cloud, negative. And so it's just a different way. It's a blood sport approach. I think some of his team, like Jason Gibbs, are very interested in takedowns, but not so interested in good governance, and we're starting to see that. My hope is that we get through this year and we start fresh next year without this kind of drama. And I will repeat, if we were passing partisan line bills, it would be a totally different story. I'd be here taking a bunch of heat along with the speaker. When the bills are passing 30-0, it's very different story. It's just very different.
How long is it gonna take for the public to realize that he's not doing good work as governor?
Well, you know, one of the things I've found when I was on the city council, which was from 2004 to 2008, local issues were covered a lot more than they are today. It really was true. The Free Press was still a daily paper that most people read every morning, and so there was a common amount of information that virtually everybody who paid attention to the news was consuming every day. It's very different today. I had 2 front page photos on the Free Press in the last 2 months. They were these great, they looked like I was a preacher. I'm standing up in the Senate speaking like this, and it's a captive audience. Everyone's listening to me. One person contacted me to say, oh my God, I saw your photo. In the old days in the Free Press, if you were on the front, it was a big deal, and people would chatter about it. So I actually think one of the things, the governor deserves credit. His position up until the day of the near miss at Fairhaven was that he was opposed to any new gun control. To his credit, he changed his position. I think we all should have the right to change our positions when things affect us personally or new information comes to light. I think many people, for them, they thought, oh, well because it was such news, that's the one data point right now that they're thinking about. Well, the problem is that was an admirable act. There are 100 other things going on that are important too. And those don't get the broad public attention that they merit, whether it's water quality. I'll tell you how absurd it is. Everyone know who Equifax is? They're the big data company that had the massive breach. And then when people tried to do a credit freeze, they charged you, despite the fact that it was their fault. There's a bill in the legislature that is on his desk right now, which charges a $100 a year fee for companies like Equifax so that they can be regulated by our Department of Financial Regulation. And it prohibits them from charging consumers a fee for placing credit freezes. The governor said he would veto this because it charges a new fee on Equifax, even though consumers would save millions possibly a year on this. And you scratch your head and say, like, what is going on? But anyways, that's a small example. The water quality one. I mean, it's hard when you say we have a huge problem that threatens, you know, the ecosystem, it's going to hurt tourism, all this stuff, and you got a governor saying, I'll veto a bill if there's even a study of how to fund water quality cleanup. I mean, it's kind of a mind bender. So I think really it's an uphill task. Campaigns are usually a forum for some of that stuff to get teased out. I don't know the extent to which this will be a competitive campaign. That's for others to determine. It should be a clash of ideas, and I hope it is, so people can see the fuller picture. And I say that again, I like Phil personally. I'm very unhappy with him right now, the way he's behaving, but something has to tease out these other underlying issues. It's not good.
So on the political piece, you have more influence and you're giving yourself credit for it. And it is my hope that my assessment of the Dems that have stepped up thus far are not maybe those who would have the best chance. So I encourage you. Now I'm not saying you should run for governor.
In
your position, I am hopeful, or still maybe slightly optimistic that a formidable or a more suitable challenger will step forth.
Yeah,
It's still early, but I'm saying.
I hear you. I rarely go into partisan forays when I'm trying to do informational exchanges like this.
This impacts like your.
It's true, and the rap after the governor was elected, immediately the vibe, the narrative, the conventional wisdom was, oh, he's unbeatable now.
Right.
And whether he is or isn't the issue, but the more people hear that, the more they start believing it. So you've got credible people who probably are interested, but say, well, I'm going to stay away because I'm told he's unbeatable. Therefore, why bother? And it is a problem because it gives him cover to skate through. I'll just give a small example. You have to appreciate how disjointed it feels when the governor was adamantly opposed to legalizing marijuana. Not that this is a huge top issue in Vermont, don't get me wrong. And then ultimately acquiesces to a plan to allow people to have like a small amount for personal use. And he is the crown prince for a huge swath of Vermonters for whom that's their big issue. And so that it kind of is indicative of where we're at as a political culture, where people really aren't seeing through one issue. They're too often they're seeing just one issue and not the whole package.
Well, what's going to be interesting to me is, Vermonters are just as upset about the national scene as anyone else in the country, but the difference between us here in Vermont and, say, folks in Pennsylvania or Ohio or some of those other states is we don't really have an opportunity to voice our displeasure this November at the ballot box. And to the extent there is any race through which folks will be able to voice their displeasure, even though it's not a national race, it will be the governor's race. And so I'll be interested to see, to the extent this is a blue wave year, as they say it, whether or not that's reflected in any capacity on the ballot. Personally, I think it will be. So I'm with Chip on this.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is people get scared off because people in this day and age don't like to lose because it feels bad. So they don't want to run and be the one who feels like a sacrificial lamb. I mean, and that's probably what holds back some people. But just take environmentalism. You'll hear people, and I don't mean to begrudge the governor on this. The governor, early on, when President Trump said he was going to back out of the Paris Accord, and Phil Scott said, I disagree with that move. Suddenly he was the darling of the environmental advocacy community, and you're saying, well, okay, now let's see the actions to back up that easy public statement. The governor stood with legislators to prevent the use of state law enforcement to be effectively roundup police for federal immigration services. And that was a good thing. We haven't seen a lot of proactivity on civil rights issues since. So it's a pretty slick political operation they have, which is the sort of the easier tasks they notch on their belt, and then on the stuff where the real action's happening out in the communities, you don't see a heck of a lot. So, anyways, I don't want to ramble. I got time for probably one more because you're probably all exhausted.
This is a difficult subject, but in terms of the opioid issues, is there anything that the legislature's done or that Governor Scott's done that can ameliorate this condition?
Well, starting with Governor Douglas, and then really ripening under Governor Shumlin, we established a system of treatment around the state, which, as inadequate as it is, and this speaks to how this whole country is way behind, we're a national model, even while we believe we're not doing nearly enough to meet people's treatment needs. The one thing we have done well with the establishment of this so-called hub and spoke model is that virtually everyone who needs treatment now can get it without much, if any, of a waiting time. In Burlington, just a year and a half ago, people were waiting 12 months or so to get the treatment they needed. And you can imagine how someone's life, once they're ready for treatment, it means their life is already in a very bad place. So the infrastructure has improved. The mental health side of this equation, where it's often co-occurring, we still have great strides ahead. Decades ago, I don't know, Gretchen, you probably know, when we deinstitutionalized, we said people should be served in the community, which conceptually made a lot of sense, but there were a lot of fractured spaces that people fell between, and we see a lot of that with some of the instances of violence and other challenges. But to say that we have major gaps to fill to properly have a system of mental health care in the state would be a massive understatement. We have workforce shortages at almost every level in the mental health field. We have a situation where if you work at the Howard Center, does anyone here work at the Howard Center? But everyone knows people who've worked at that. It's impossible to live in Chittenden County, not know someone who's worked there at least or works there. If you work at the Howard Center and you're like a clinical social worker, I'm roughly estimating you probably make 30% less than your exact same counterpart at UVM Medical Center. Same job, same qualifications, same stress load, 30% less benefits, and your work environment's probably more stressful. That's true of virtually every position in our mental health agencies around the state, because over the years, hospitals go through one process of getting their budget approved, which is they go to a bunch of bureaucrats in a room and they say, we need another $20 million, and the bureaucrats say, well, it's really confusing, we guess you need it, here's your $20 million. And mental health agencies historically have had to go to the legislature and get a budget, which is fighting with everything else we have to pay for. And so mental health agencies come in and say, can we get a 1% increase in our budget? And the legislature says, oh, we've been very generous, we gave them a 1% budget. And what that's built in over time is this two-tiered system. There's no explanation for it that's good. There just is that historic departure. So what you have is, at the Howard Center and its counterparts throughout the state, you have this constant churn of employees because the pay is so low. And the best people get poached immediately by UVM, UVM Medical Center, Dartmouth, Northwest Medical Center. They get poached the moment that someone identifies them as a really exemplary employee. Now, some of the best people stay because they believe in the agency, they believe in the work, but competitively, it's just at such cross purposes. We also have policies which frankly are just difficult. Involuntary commitment and involuntary treatment are probably the most, from a philosophical point of view, the most excruciating decisions. Taking away someone's liberty is not something you do easily or lightly. So when we have someone who, there was a well-publicized example of the individual who had 100 interactions with the cops over a period of 2 years, who slugged the restaurant owner at the corner of Pearl and Winooski. Well known by the cops, well known by the mental health agencies. without speaking to that individual, that type of case, the question is, what is public's role? What is society's role in both allowing that individual to have autonomy, but also making sure the public's safe? The state of Vermont is an outlier historically in allowing people to not be involuntarily committed or involuntarily medicated. That's been a decision that's now been baked into our culture for many decades. But it comes with a consequence, which is from time to time we will see something happen and people will say, why didn't government step in earlier? Why didn't a mental health agency step in and force this person to go to a hospital or something? We are making major strides, though, on the physical space. We have a bunch of millions of dollars this year that we're deploying to increase the amount of bed space. One of the things, there has also been a historical argument against creating too many so-called mental health beds for fear that if you built them, you would fill them because it's expensive to operate them. So the idea was if you've got an $800,000 a bed space, you will want someone to be there. I'll pull Sam Beal off the street and say, I think he needs to go there because you want to make it economical. As a result, we constrained the number of beds. Then we found very quickly the emergency rooms started flooding with people who really needed to be in a therapeutic environment, but there was no bed space for them. So I think the lesson has been learned that even if there's a cost associated with it, better to have the space with a little bit of cushion or flex than to not have the space when you really need it. So I think that emergency room issue, which we've all been reading about for the last couple of years, we're going to start seeing some improvement this year. So anyway, stay tuned. The news will, I don't know if it's going to be interesting, but there will be news. We're going to show up on Wednesday next week, and then we'll likely actually adjourn for another week just to see what other bills the governor vetoes and what we need to be thinking about. And my own senators are saying, well, like, how's it all going to work? And I'm saying, well, we're kind of in it together figuring this out. It's we've not been down this road together. So you can all contact me anytime you want by email. I'm pretty good about getting back promptly. So thanks for having me. And once the veto session's over, or the special session, I'm happy to come back and do a dust cleared what happened.
Well, we had Chris Pearson, Ginny Lyons, and Mary Sullivan here in December for a preview of sorts. And now we have you here as a wrap-up, and I think it's something this NPA should continue doing in the years to come.
Well, and what I would be happy to do, and I can obviously be accompanied by the reps or other senators here, is each year we do a ton of things that directly influence Burlington. It takes us a little time to really distill that, but I think that might be a helpful thing for people to understand how our work, both policy and funding, filters down directly to Burlington. Some of it's transportation, you were talking about that from the City Council report, some of it's environmental issues, some of it's social policies and others. So I think that might be a fun thing to do. And
it would be. And thanks so much for coming.
No, thank you guys.
All right, so that does it for this evening. Stay tuned for details on our June event. Thanks.
Only the steering committee.